Okay, y'all, let's try some more here. We got a Subaru Outback that has a gas tank that holds 18.5 gallons of fuel. We should get, in city driving, 25 miles per gallon. All right. So my question in 7 is, if that's the average, how many miles should you be able to drive? Now, I know that, again, these are all averages, like we spoke of in the last video, but we can at least get an idea for how far we can drive. So we know that we get 25 mpg, 25 miles per 1 gallon. All right. The question, how many miles? This is going to sound like the scooter question from before, right? We want to get miles out on this side. Miles out on this side. So we know what we got to do. We got to get rid of gallons, just like we did before. So it becomes unit arithmetic with dimensional analysis, just like I promised. We're going to have 18.5 gallons of fuel. So we're going to multiply that by 18.5 gallons over 1. If that bothers you, just put it over 1. Okay, miles technically is also over 1. Again, so the gallons are going to divide off. Boop, boop. And all we got to do is 25 times 18.5 gives us about 462.5. So roughly 460 miles city. Right? 462.5 is a little bit ridiculous precision to have that precise an answer. As anybody who's ever run out of gas or almost run out of gas knows, these numbers can fluctuate up or down. So around 460, 450 miles city. The next question is the same question, except it's highway driving, which with pure gas engines generally gets you better mileage because it's more efficient, because you don't stop and start and stop and start. The engine's allowed to run a little bit more efficiently. So the difference there is it's 32 miles a gallon. The problem is the same. I mean, literally, it's exactly the same. Except you're going to change this to 32. You still have 18.5 gallons in the tank. So we're just going to change 25 to 32. So we end up with about 592. So roughly 600 miles highway. All right. Here's a little applied problem. We're going to learn later about our Tahoe. We have a Tahoe that we use to pull like trailers and things like that when we need to. Try not to drive it too much, as you're about to see why. At one fill up, it had 67,162 miles on it. At the next fill up, we added 24.6 gallons of gas, and the odometer then read 67,540. On average, how many miles per gallon did the Tahoe get between those fill-ups? Now, you could just make an assumption here. This is an average and it's an approximation. You can assume that we fill up the tank after having used essentially the same amount of gas each time. Like, we don't just drive the Tahoe over to top it off. We get it down about the same level and then take it to fill it up. So you could assume that when we added those 24.6 gallons of gas and the odometer read 67,540, that we used that 24.6 gallons of gas. So the question really is we've got miles and we've got gallons, and I'm asking how many miles per gallon. So this is going to look slightly different than this problem here. This problem here, we knew the miles per gallon of the Subi, and we had to figure out how far we were going to go. Now, we know how far we went, and we know how many gallons it took us to get there. Or at least we kind of know how far we went, right? We have to figure that out. So let's see. If I started at 67,540 and subtract 67,162, check my math on this, I'm going to get 378 miles. I went 378 miles, check my math. And that took me, how did I say, 24.6? 24.6 gallons of gas to get there. So you see, this is our new problem, pure unit arithmetic. Or this problem that we just did in the past question 7 and 8 was more of a unit arithmetic fraction combined with multiplication to do dimensional analysis, now we're back to just unit arithmetic. So in order to get this down to per gallon, we got to divide the 24.6 into the 378, and I get about 15.4 miles per gallon. About 15.4 miles per gallon. All right. Next question, because I think it ties to this one. We're supposed to get between 14 and 18 miles per gallon, according to all the literature that I read. And this is why we try not to drive this thing very often, because that is horrendous. Does this seem okay? Well, it does. It does. It's kind of right between them, right? It's not as bad as 14. It's not as good as 18, but it's in that range. So as long as we're supposed to get between that, seems fine. Okay, let's take a look at the last couple here before we set you loose on the back third. Okay, so these next two are kind of my favorite because it's still pure unit arithmetic. Absolutely pure unit arithmetic. But it takes a unit that you're used to and flips it on its head. Let's take a look. So the Subaru gets, in the city, 25 miles per gallon. I'm going to write that out. 25 miles, or MPG. That's what I've got written on the paper. Which means 25 miles per gallon. And again, these are great because you can communicate this with people and they understand what you're talking about. Another way of writing it is, as we've been writing it, is 25 miles per 1 gallon. And all of those mean the same thing. Every one of those three things means exactly the same thing. But I'm not asking you that here. I'm asking you in this one, how many gallons does the Subi use per mile? Not miles per gallon, but gallons per mile. And you might hear that at first and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, gallons per mile. It does make sense. It's just you're not used to hearing it. But here's what I want you to think of. Don't overthink it. All I'm asking you is make a new unit, gallons per mile. Not miles per gallon, but gallons per mile. In other words, instead of the 1 being on the gallon, I want the 1 to be on the mile. That's it. That's it. That's the only difference. Now, how do you do that? Well, you might be worried about this a little bit, but then you gotta realize something. Where's my eraser? Here we go. You've already got everything you need right here. Because this fraction is set up so that it's 25 miles over 1 gallon. It's almost like these units are reversed. You want the miles down here and the gallons up here. Well, we can do that now, can't we? Just take the 1 gallon and put it up top per 25 miles and put that in your denominator. And now look, gallons per mile, gallons per mile. You've got the unit in the right place. All you have to do now is divide 1 by 25. Which I know you're going to say, you can't do that. You can. That's why we have decimals, right? That's why we have numbers less than 1. 1 divided by 25 is going to be 4 hundredths of a gallon per mile. 4 hundredths of a gallon per mile. Now, what does 4 hundredths of a gallon look like? I have a second video, or I guess a third video to follow this one that'll show you. I break it down to tablespoons, which is a much easier thing. 0.04 gallons. You're probably envisioning a gallon in your mind, like a gallon of milk or, a gallon jug of something. 0.04, 4 hundredths of a gallon is extraordinarily small. But it's easier to view it in something smaller like a teaspoon, or in my case, a tablespoon. So we'll get to that in a second. So when you see a new unit, like gallons per mile, don't overthink it. For example, in the highway driving, we get 32 miles per gallon. Another way of conveying that same information is it takes 1 gallon per 32 miles. Now you've got the right unit. You've got the unit you want, gallons per mile. All you've got to do is do the division here. So that's going to be what? About 0.03? 0.03, you can check it with your calculators if you want to, gallons per mile. And this number makes sense, right? Because since you get better mileage highway, it should use less gas per mile on the highway than it does in the city. And we mentioned before, hopefully the intuitiveness of the answer should make sense. You should never finish a math problem and go, man, that number doesn't make sense. That means one of two things might be true. First of all, you may have made a mistake somewhere, which is always a good kind of self-check. But also, you might be onto something. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the course statistically. Okay, let's take a look at some other vehicles' fuel economies and talk about what I was chatting about with tablespoons versus gallons of gas now.